Hey everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm a student at the Chair for Data Analysis and Visualization at the University of Constance. Amongst others, I've been working with Matthias, who gave a talk at last year's workshop about visual musicology. Using the methodology transfer as presented in that talk, I introduce you to a novel visualization of rhythm that augments sheet music called the Rhythmic Fingerprints. In this first example, can you recognize any difference in the rhythm between the two measures? It's hard to spot, right? And you won't, because these rhythms are identical. Now take these two measures for a change. Do you think that there's any rhythmic subpattern common to both of them? Again, difficult to answer with a lot of notes, huh? Turns out that there are even multiple common subpatterns, and here are just two examples. Lastly, let's take a look at this larger excerpt. Can you tell whether there are any rhythmic patterns that appear more than once? It will take you some time to go through, so here are just some examples I identified for you. As you've seen, none of these questions have trivial answers, yet all of them are part of what could be the analysis of rhythm in a new piece of music you encounter. As for rhythm, we use two defining dimensions, namely onset and duration. Here onset defines the point in time when a sound sets in, as you can see with 0, where the half note starts to play. Meanwhile, the duration is the time that passes between two onsets. For example, the half note sounds in between the onsets 0 and 1. Focusing on the second dimension, the duration, we can make use of the so-called rhythm tree for further characterization. In this exemplary measure, the rhythm tree illustrates the division of the measure's duration into the different notes. The half note represents the first half of the measure. The remaining half splits equally amongst the quarter and eighth notes, which again bisect their half. Generalizing this idea, the rhythm tree on the right is similar to phrase structure trees used to describe sentences in linguistics. It enables to express a wide spectrum of rhythms. While this instance of the rhythm tree provides powerful capabilities to describe rhythmic patterns, one is to be cautious as it only applies to simple meters. In addition, we distinguish between notes and rests to assign them complementary color scales, which we will later use in the rhythmic fingerprints. With the theoretical background established, it remains to figure out how we can visualize the rhythm tree. As I teased in the introduction, we rely on methodology transfer to take inspiration from an already established solution in another domain. Therefore, our more general problem statement is how to visualize a binary tree. With all that being said, genealogy turns out to be a domain of particular interest. Amongst other things, genealogy researches the ancestry of a person, which happens to lay out as a binary tree. A fan chart is a common method to visualize such an ancestry. The radial display concentrically shows generations of ancestry, with the oldest generation being on the outermost disk. Now we got the analogy between the rhythm tree in musicology and the ancestry in genealogy. As the fan chart visualizes the latter, what can we come up with in musicology to visualize the rhythm tree? A radial display of concentric circles with the longest duration at the center and the shortest one in the outermost. As a foundation for the design of the rhythmic fingerprint, we use a radial display. This decision is reasonable as we operate in the time domain and rhythm is inherently cyclical. Besides, humans are used to the clock metaphor and hence should have an easier time reading this radial visualization over a linear design. Starting at noon, time moves clockwise and each concentric circle represents the duration of a whole note divided into 32 arcs at most. That is, the outermost disk represents 30-second notes, while the innermost disk represents the whole note. To represent rhythm in the skeleton, we use the previously mentioned color scales and fill the arcs corresponding to the notes. In this exemplary measure, the half note appears at the beginning, hence at noon in the disk for half notes. Looking at the rhythm tree, we use the color assigned to half notes and fill the arc like this. The quarter note occurs after half of the measure and therefore at 6 o'clock. The last two eighth notes follow the same principle. The example we just exercised consisted of a single voice. Now let's see how the rhythmic fingerprint works out for two or more voices. To make things a little easier, we first pretend to have the two voices in two separate measures, generating two rhythmic fingerprints. As previously, we color the first rest according to the assigned color scale. The following dotted quarter note is somewhat special. As you may have recognized, none of the disks in the rhythmic fingerprint represents the duration of dotted notes. Therefore, we display dotted notes in the disk of the next longer duration. In this example, the dotted quarter note appears in the disk of half notes with an adapted arc length that represents 3/3 of a half note. This also greatly illustrates that notes can appear outside of the predefined arcs in the disk. In this joint rhythmic fingerprint, there are two things you should take note of. Firstly, we prefer the presence of sound over its absence, such that a note will be displayed if it appears with a rest of the same onset and duration. Secondly, the multiplicity of notes, as with the last eighth note in each voice, is not specifically treated in the rhythmic fingerprint, as it does not change the perceived rhythm. If we repeat the procedure that we just walked through, we can annotate every measure of a score to arrive at an augmentation of CommonMusic Notation with the rhythmic fingerprints. To validate the usefulness of the rhythmic fingerprints, we conducted a qualitative user study for novices and for experts. During the analysis, the participant received 2 scores in random order, with the rhythmic fingerprints annotated on one of the sheets only. For the user study, we used the 2 scores area and variation 7 from the Goldberg variations by Bach. The former plays in 3/4 time, while the latter uses 6/8 time. Both pieces consist of 64 measures, exhibit similar complexity, and have a form of AB-AB, CD-CD. These similarities are the primary reason for us to use these 2 scores. During the analysis, we asked the participants to annotate all rhythmic patterns that they could find, preferably starting with the longer ones. Here you can see an example from one of the novices. On the left are the annotations for area without the rhythmic fingerprints, which they exercised at first. On the right, you can see the annotations for the second score, variation 7, with the rhythmic fingerprints augmented. Their improvement with the rhythmic fingerprints agrees with the positive feedback from the remaining participants. Most of them favored the rhythmic fingerprints over the CommonMusic Notation to spot recurrent rhythmic patterns. Also, the participants reported that the rhythmic fingerprints eased their analysis and created visually clear patterns. This allowed them to find similarity and dissimilarities more easily. Besides this positive feedback, the participants were worried that the used colors are too similar, which made it difficult for some of them to get used to the rhythmic fingerprints. On top of the feedback by the participants, we want to shortly discuss 2 limitations of the rhythmic fingerprints. As we've seen while iterating the design, the rhythmic fingerprint encodes all voices present in a score. On the contrary, though, it's not possible to reconstruct the encoded voices from the rhythmic fingerprint. For example, as seen earlier, the rest of the second voice is not visible in this rhythmic fingerprint. With our instance of the rhythm tree as the foundation, the rhythmic fingerprint does not represent every time signature equally well. 2/2 and 4/4 time do not pose any issues as they fit into and fill up the duration of a whole note. However, for time signatures with a total duration of less than a whole note per measure, the rhythmic fingerprint will exhibit white space. These time signatures also illustrate the ambiguity of rhythm, as the simple meter of 3/4 time and the compound meter of 6/8 time look the same in the rhythmic fingerprint. That's because our instance of the rhythm tree does not take this ambiguity into account and is suited for simple meter only. Lastly, the rhythmic fingerprint cannot represent the red-colored group of time signatures up here, as they exceed the total duration of a whole note per measure. Rendering them regardless would inevitably lead to overlap or 2 rhythmic fingerprint instances. We want to improve the visualization design regarding voice separation and time signatures as we've just elaborated. Besides, we intend to align the rhythmic fingerprints region of interest with the context, as rhythmic fingerprints might not always adhere to the boundaries of measures, but could start somewhere in the middle, as in this example. And lastly, we plan to experiment with the display of dotted notes. Currently, they are moved in the disk of the next longer duration. However, their display could turn out to be more intuitive if they remain within the disk of their base duration. Thank you very much for your attendance. I'm very happy to discuss the rhythmic fingerprints and their further development with you.